Good morning. We can get a little cozier in this room, huh? It's my honor and pleasure to be here with you today. And Arthur, thank you for that very generous introduction. My favorite introduction that I've ever gotten, with all due respect to the one that you gave, is he's a guy whose impact is greater than his hype, and I'm very worried that my proportions are starting to get out of whack. So I want to apologize for two things. The first is that for those of you who came to hear me talk about how to save the world, I have a very cool talk that at some point you will hear me do about how we need to unleash our kids on solving the world's toughest problems, and in fact, get them more engaged in school by doing so, and at the same time, solve real problems like 100 mile per hour gallon gas cars and things of that nature. But one of the things that I've learned about myself is if I feel like I need to talk about something, it's a good idea to go ahead and do it. Otherwise, what I plan to talk about won't work. So last night, I redid my talking points. And so I'm going to apologize for the second time because I'm about to break about every rule there is about how to do a great speech. But I want you to stay with me if you can, and then I want us to talk at the end. Because we're here at a really unusual time. It's a great time. At South by Southwest, you've seen new entrepreneurs and educators all talking about great ideas, policymakers talking about how they're trying to break down barriers. You've heard all those great things, and we are now, you can feel the energy. You can feel that we're kind of at an inflection point, and I'm very, very concerned that if we don't pay really close attention, we'll fall off the rails. Let me just touch on one quick point. This is from my original talk. In 1966, RFK said, "There's discrimination in this world and slavery and slaughter and starvation. Governments repress their people, millions are trapped in poverty while the nation grows rich and wealth is lavished on armaments everywhere. These are differing evils, but they are the common works of man." That was 47 years ago. Sounds eerily familiar. And yet he went on to say, "It is a revolutionary world we live in, and this generation at home and around the world has had thrust upon it a greater burden of responsibility than any generation that has ever lived." And yet today, once again, we think about the world that our children are growing up into, the challenges that they'll face around energy, around sustainability, around all of climate change, around war. And we think that, in fact, we are handing them a world that is actually more challenging even than we encountered. Yet our children, every generation, are our hope. They come into the world full of promise, full of potential, naturally curious, naturally open, naturally with an instinct to attach and love. They enter our families and then ultimately enter our schools. And something happens to them. I gave a talk a while back and I said, how many times have you ever met a 2 or 3-year-old that you didn't think was like the smartest and most creative kid that you'd ever met? Every time you meet one, you think, this kid has got to be a genius. And yet we know that as we go on and we encounter them again in 3rd and 4th grade, a few less of them seem that way. And by the time you get to middle school, a few less seem that way. What are we doing to take those gifts from our children? We here are trying to actually embark on a revolution in education to transform the way education works. The challenge is that most revolutions end with people still oppressed by the same or a different or cruel master. When the revolution is not successful, it's called an uprising. Uprisings are put down. Sometimes when revolutions happen, new leadership comes in, but nothing really changes for the most people. We cannot afford for that to be the case for education and this revolution that we're trying to create in teaching and learning this time. I look across the room and I see people who are old enough to have been there the last time. It was going to be different this time. In fact, it was going to be different because of the role of technology. So the question is, how are we going to actually win this revolution? How are we going to make sure that our kids have the opportunities that we so desperately want to give them, that they deserve, and frankly, that they've been promised? Well, it's a really interesting thing. Whenever I give talks, up until this point, especially when I was trying to get people energized, there's two questions I always talked about what revolutionaries have to believe. Anyone trying to achieve anything big. The first question is, what do you believe? Now, you'll note that this says 2 + 2 questions. And as we go on, I'll talk about, it's not just about the first 2 questions. It's also going to be about the last 2 questions. One of the most successful revolutions in history was the American Revolution, and it started with the Declaration of Independence. They declared that we actually had the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that clarity made it very easy for everyone to be clear about what the outcome and objective was and how they would know they had won. What kind of institutions and structures they would set up to make sure that they were protecting those things, which led to what they actually built to sustain what they aspired to during the revolution. I'm talking to the choir here, but I want to be clear about what it is that we say we believe, because we need to be clear that most people don't. Most people believe that the world looks like this. I'm not going to argue whether or not the bell curve exists. But what I am going to argue is that what we've done is we've taken what is a statistical definition and built systems around it. We've built systems that basically insist that there will be a distribution of students across the spectrum, which was not intended to be that. Why shouldn't it look like this? Why won't it look like this? And the question is, what will we do to ensure that it does? For some number of us, the definition of a successful revolution is when we as adults take responsibility for taking children and moving them to that place of success. Not just a few, but all. And when they are all there and we sustain it, that is the definition of winning the revolution. So then the second question is, if that's what you believe, then what are you willing to do? Here's the interesting thing about it. We clearly have demonstrated we're willing to do tremendous amounts. Teachers go into classrooms any day, principals, leaders, counselors, every day in there working extraordinarily hard. Parents making sacrifices to give their kids good educational opportunities. Philanthropy, entrepreneurs, investors, all focusing on how they can actually cause great things to happen. Unfortunately, we've not seen the fruits of our labors. We still are seeing many, and most of our children struggle and fail. That's not just in this country. That, frankly, is now around the world, where economies all over the world are realizing that, frankly, not only for their economic growth, but for their very stability, education is the key, especially for their girls. So why, if we are willing to do so much, are we not seeing those outcomes? Because of the third question. I used to not talk about this, but I think it's really important that we do. Some of you may disagree with me, and I hope we actually argue about it if we do. But the next question is, what do we know how to do? This is both at the individual level, at the institution level, and as a collective we as revolutionaries that want to see that outcome. And it has 2 parts to it. The first thing is, in my world, why do innovations fail? Why does an individual innovation fail? 3 usual reasons. Either a failure of knowledge, you didn't understand enough about how it was supposed to work, what made it work. A failure of design and engineering. You understood what you were trying to do, but your design didn't lead to that actually happening. Or, related to, your design didn't lead to anybody wanting to adopt it or use it. We have more understandings than we've ever had today about how people learn and how you identify and describe what people need to learn, and how you actually get people motivated and get them into a growth mindset so that they persist. Yet I'd be very curious, I won't ask for a show of hands, about how many of our folks that are launching enterprises, that are doing professional development, have grounded themselves in even these basics. And I can attest very clearly that in fact our learning agenda, our research agenda around learning is actually fragmented, disorganized, and is not designed to drive towards tremendously different outcomes. I love AERA. I love how many researchers are committed to doing that kind of work, to doing the work of improving education, to answering the important questions about what our kids need. Yet I am astonished often when I look through the catalog, which is about the old Yellow Pages thick, at how disconnected much of the work seems from actually improving anyone's life on the student or the teacher side. So I propose, and I'd love to have this discussion, that there are 7 quick questions I want to throw out that we need to be pursuing. How people learn. The neuroscience, the cognitive science, the behavioral science, we are learning more about those things, and yet we have not been in a disciplined way connecting those things to the educational process. Identifying and describing what people need to learn, whether you're talking about it at the higher ed level in careers or in K-12, the process still looks eerily the same again. Really well-intentioned, often well-informed people getting in a room with Post-it notes and discussing which ones are dependent on which and how important that is. There's no reason anymore for this to happen, especially with the use of technology. The things that we used to theorize about and have ideologies about, we can actually answer empirically. How do people demonstrate mastery, and how do we validate it? Very careful not to use the assessment word here. Oftentimes we struggle with, how do we actually let people show us that what they know? And in doing so, know that in fact, we should give them the credit, whatever it is, let them progress, because they have demonstrated that they've mastered that particular skill or area of knowledge. The better we get at this, the more sophisticated we get, the more opaque it will be. The conversations that we have today about testing and assessment will go out with the dinosaur, because assessment will be both formative and summative. It will tell us what is happening and a lot about why it happened. It will give feedback to both the student and the educator, and it will be seamless. As one person said to me, it will be just like learning, but without any help. And then obviously, what learning experiences produce and accelerate mastery? This all seems obvious, but the reality is that if you looked at our R&D agenda, it is detached from this work. So you walk through, what are the kinds of learning experiences? And how can you get there? Is it really a comm video, or is there some better way to learn it? What delivery methodologies, and how does this actually change given all those other things? How does it change when it's teacher-led? How does it change when it's peer-led? How does it change when it's online? How does it change when it's a combination of online and in class? These things all are interrelated and they connect. But again, the R&D agenda is not connected to it. And then we're hearing a lot more about, and I'm glad, how do you increase interest and engagement, effort and persistence and resilience? How do you actually drive those things, and how are they connected to all of those other things that I listed? When you're working online in a particular kind of a learning experience, how do you help someone to push through? What kind of support do they need that when you see them falling back that you can get them to re-engage? How is that different than when they're sitting in class? Or is it? And then finally, how do you optimize all of this given individual and environmental context? On each one of these things, the question is always for whom and in what context. If we are as aggressive about pursuing an agenda like this as we are in the health field, where we invest close to $70 billion a year, $60 billion a year, and that's only on the public sector side. Just so you're clear, we invest less than $1 billion in the R&D agenda on the public side in education. we can get real breakthroughs. Design and engineering. I was having a great conversation with someone the other day about the state of products in the field of education. And we were really happy to talk about how much progress has been made. Because even when there's great substantive content, we were both kind of stumbling over a way to say, oh, it's not as sophisticated, and then we finally landed on, it just sucks. The user interface compared to all the other things that you interact with, whether it was an online game for kids or it was a tool for capturing information or productivity, supporting productivity in the classroom, it was always very cumbersome, somewhat often detached from what it is that you were doing in the classroom. You know, it was a very rational decision for teachers when they had maybe 3 computers or 4 computers in the back of the classroom, 1 or 2 of which may be working at a given point in time, to make a decision that they weren't going to reorganize their work around how they were going to integrate technology into the classroom. A shame, but fairly rational decision. We're moving past that phase, and now we have a different, more sophisticated challenge. How do we make sure that, you know, when I talk to entrepreneurs, that we're designing things that actually aren't so focused on getting to tomorrow's aspiration, that again, we miss addressing the teacher's need? That, in fact, we're creating things that make people's lives so much easier, student or teacher, that they want to pick it up right away because it makes things better. And then evolve them and evolve it in a way that lets them make that transition. We can create new environments. We can do lots of different things. All of that is going to take time. All of our innovations need to get to scale. So we're going to have to find ways to create solutions that can scale, that can help pull us, the millions of teachers and the millions of students, not the dozens, to the future. You're not meant to read this chart. But the important thing here is, what I just talked about is why innovations, and individual innovation fails. Why does innovation in a sector fail? And innovation in a sector fails because the ecosystem has failed. And when I go around the ecosystem for education, whether it's the lack of clarity about what the goals were, or the lack of incentives through the funding structures to actually get better or faster, or whether it was what I just talked about the incoherent R&D system, or the lack of investment or the paucity on entrepreneurs entering the sector because it is actually a difficult market. Or for education technology, is it the fact that the infrastructure is actually not there to support the work? Or that there's no one there to show the districts or the schools how to use it and implement it? When it gets to adoption and use, the basic questions, again, we talked about the design issues, but then there's just a lack of understanding about how is this going to make life better? Even for the best and most simplest products, I have to be able to see my way to using this to change what I'm going to do every day. Our entire ecosystem is fractured and broken. That means that policymakers, educators, entrepreneurs, advocates, we all have work to do. And if we don't do that work, then we will see, once again, a moment go by where we said, wow, it should have been different that time. We don't have that time again. So now we've got all this context about why and when it doesn't work. So we now have the knowledge that we can continue to build a framework both for what we need to learn, but also how we're going to execute going forward. Which brings you to the 4th question. Can and will we execute? Now here's the difference. The difference between what kind of effort you're willing to do and our can and will you execute is both about what you know, but also do you capture the moment? Innovation is a combination of great solutions and opportunity meeting each other. Oftentimes the solution is prepared because they see the opportunity. Sometimes they miss each other. Does anyone remember back in the late 90s, a company called UNext? I see a couple hands going up. UNext, for those of you who don't know, was a company that had a brilliant idea. It was to take the best professors from around the world at the top universities and make them available through technology, mostly video with some interactivity. Has anyone heard of UNext? Sometimes a great solution misses its window of opportunity. This window of opportunity, we are at a point in inflection. We have the potential to change not only outcomes in this country, but around the world. Here's where I get a little proprietary. Some country will figure this out and make the investments and make the sacrifices and push through the difficult parts of the change. I'd like it to be us. Fundamentally, the question is, are we ready for what we say we want in a revolution? Are we willing to do that hard work? Are we willing to learn what we don't know? Are we willing to recognize that at this stage of development, we're all in this together? At this part of an industry's development, if you're in the education technology sector, if you think you have competitors, you are wrong. You have people, if they are trying to open the market, who may be your competitors, but right now, since you all amount to less than 1% of share, you better be helping each other out. When it comes to speaking with one voice about the importance of R&D in the education space, I often have this argument all the time. I do not understand why we think it is really important to invest in defense R&D, in health R&D, in energy R&D, where whole private sectors and industries are built upon the R&D that's funded by the public sector. And yet, when we get to the education space, the very people who could benefit the most advocate against investment in R&D in the space. That may be changing, but our voices are not loud enough, and we're not working together enough to get it done. Infrastructure. We are in a time of unprecedented contraction of public spending. But the reality is that our schools are not connected. All of these great solutions need a way to get to the students that need them most. By the way, it is most expensive to get it to the students who are in rural communities. We all know this intuitively, but I think that people often think that when we talk about this kind of thing, we're talking about wiring up inner city schools. You can wire up every inner city school in this country for less than $1 billion. The other $6 billion or so, that's about kids in the country, especially in the mountains. $7 billion a week in Iraq. What are we willing to do? And finally, adoption and use. I've been really gratified at this conference that there are so many educators around. I heard two things that made me really excited. One was excited not in the best way, which is what I pointed out. People trying to figure out, how is all this cool stuff I'm going to hearing about, how is that going to help me every day? How is that going to help me tomorrow? What I was excited about was they were asking that question. But the second thing I heard was, this is fantastic. This is just the kind of energy I needed. I love interacting with these people from these other sectors. It really changes the way I think about what the opportunity is. Oftentimes, people have a habit of talking about educators as if they're a monolith, as if those individual teachers are somehow this big glob. Teachers get into teaching not for the money, not for the summers off, though they are nice. Most of them, I know, work because of the money. They get in to help kids. They get in to be successful at changing life outcomes. And we ask them to go into classrooms every single day, 20, 25, nowadays not uncommon to see 35 to 40. And we ask them to do this, to know what each kid knows, to know what each kid is interested in, to know what each kid needs, and then meet them with the perfect content and instructional approach. And what do we do what do we give them to do that? Colored markers and a whiteboard. So, they're doing their part. Time for us to do ours. Thank you. Now I think we can do Q&A. Lights up. Anyone? Bueller?
Rob Fauché from Dallas. I've been in the industry for many, many years, and you're right, this is maybe the third wave that I've seen, at least anyway. So the question that I have, I'd like to go back to that slide of why innovations fail, which is, I think, probably the most important slide in the talk. Yep. What do you think are the points of leverage to change the system or change the ecosystem this time around?
Sure.
Given political realities, given all the vested interests and so on, what are the points of leverage?
So I think that there are some of the challenges actually present an opportunity. The reality is that almost every state now, regardless of whether participating in the Common Core or not, has set in place a set of standards that are significantly more rigorous than what they've had before. That means we've raised collectively our expectations. You know, it's always important to remember that standards are just your expectations of your kids written down. That is happening at the same time as I talked about, is having this contraction of public resources. Meaning, we want more for less. The only way that that has ever happened is for people to come up with new kinds of solutions to allow people to actually improve, people don't like this word, but productivity, to get better with whatever resources are already available. That creates a window of opportunity where people who normally are not open to actually new solutions are open to them. The second thing is that we now have enough examples of people doing good work, leveraging this technology, that people can see that it is actually empowering. In particular, I'll use teachers as an example, to teachers. Once teachers, especially where they've been prepared, get a hold of the tools and resources that we're talking about, they pull it in. They pull it in because they realize that they have actually gotten a capability that they didn't have before. It makes their lives easier and better. The most compelling stories that I hear when I go out are the veteran teachers who were at first reticent when the technology came in, then participated a little bit just to see what would happen or because someone pushed them. And then they realized that, in fact, they never want to go back. The third thing is that we keep forgetting about the opportunities on the edges. And the reality is that the only way that we're going to close the gaps that we keep talking about closing is through, the Secretary talks about more time. Everyone now is well versed on the summer learning gap. Everyone talks about after school and the weekends. We can't afford to do that with the traditional ways we've been doing it. When we can demonstrate that we can use these new tools and resources to actually transform outcomes, to accelerate learning, to create new contexts and empower kids to take full control of their learning, more doors will open. This is all not going to happen overnight, but in the context that we can create as a federal government, state governments, and philanthropists, corporations and others, is to provide resources for people to try it out, pilot it, and do the work, both creating models of how it can work for some, while giving others the courage to try. Sir?
So I guess I'm going to be the grump this morning.
That's good.
A
little boring if not.
If we know anything about our educational system, is that it is extraordinarily resistant to change. And so, to borrow the title of a terrific book on educational or history of educational reform, we tinker towards utopia.
Yep.
So, given the fact that we know that this system is so resistant to change, do you think that we ought to be looking to change the system from within, endogenous, or do we look for exogenous forces that will somehow change the system?
So, and both. This conversation about oh, wow, should you bother with the current system? So I personally am not patient enough to wait for organic growth from outside the system to get to the point where it's scaled, where in fact all the kids switch over. I think that what is likely to happen, as we see this happen in other sectors, is that new entrants will come in, new technologies will come in. Some of them will come in as tools to support the existing system because those markets are at scale. Some of them will be new models which actually push from the edges and actually steal share. And that what will happen is that you'll see a new sector emerge with more competitors in it. We've already trying to create the environment where that can happen. So my focus is not on either or, it's creating the context where both sectors can flourish, creating the conditions where the incentives actually line up. So just to be really, really, really clear about it, the 4 pillars of Race to the Top are very specific. It is set goals that matter, have the data systems to whether you're making progress or not, make the main thing for both people and institutions around learning outcomes for children, and deal with your worst performers. Anybody who's been in business would tell you, thank you very much for that business one-on-one lesson. We have not had those conditions in the education sector. With that basic framework, it sets the context for any institution to get in and play the game, to want to do the right thing. And if we are actually take the next step, driving towards more performance-based funding and outcomes-based funding, then we'll actually have a marketplace that can actually work. In that context, I'm expecting that both institutional providers that are current traditional players and folks on the outside are going to get into play, and we'll see the marketplace change. But I'm not going to wait around for small-scale institutions to get to 40% or 50% of the market over the next 3 decades. I don't have time. Sir.
Hi, I'm Jason. I work with Digital Promise in the League of Innovative Schools in DC. Jim, I know you and the department talk a lot about sort of innovation clusters, kind of places where there are some of these things going on, but that they can also become kind of islands of innovation. Essentially none of that gets out and affects anyone beyond those communities. So what are some examples of some places where a lot of these barriers are being overcome, and then what might we be able to do to have them be examples for folks outside of that area?
So a couple of things. One is that whenever you take on a job with innovation in the title, you have to decide what definition you're going to use because there's a lot of them. The one I've decided is most important for us in the space of education is significantly better than the status quo, and it goes to scale. If it's just significantly better than the status quo, then it's a nice invention. Thank you very much. But it has to impact the lives of thousands or tens of thousands or millions of kids who are the target in order to make a difference. In that context, we actually need much more innovation on how you take the things that work to scale. The examples of that, frankly, the work of Digital Promise is some of the things, and the work that the districts and states are doing in consortia around Race to the Top, both district and state, are some of the things that I see that are most promising as mechanisms for diffusion. But they are still only promising. Most of the time, what we're seeing still is innovations are slow to grow. Things that people uniformly agree are good, well, nothing people uniformly agree are good, but that most people think are good still are growing very incrementally across the system.
I'm Giselle Huff with the Jacqueline Newman Foundation. So I'm glad you said about the definition of innovation, because if you think about the job of teaching in the 21st century, it really should be bifurcated, where content is provided by technology and pedagogy, connecting the dots, is provided by the teacher. We should relieve the teacher of all the grunt work that they have to do with the checking off, 50 tests with the little bubbles and all of that. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. So really the solution lies in a partnership between the teacher and the computer. And innovation should be about that, because everything else and I'm saying this because when I see what happened with I3, where not you, but the definition of innovation was something like $50 million to TFA and $50 million to KIP, both of which had been in existence for 20 years at that time. So that was to scale them, but you can't scale them fast enough or in a big enough way that it's going to have an impact on the 50 million kids who are going to school today.
Sure.
So, at what point in time are you going to have, and let me back up for a second, the race to the top districts, which was supposed to emphasize personalized learning, when I look at what, the results were and the people who won, I'm wondering what, the connection was between that phrase and the things that won. There is no clarity. I mean, at least from my point of view. From my point of view, that, where the bifurcation is the thing.
So sure. So two things, Giselle. One is that I'm going to give a slightly longer answer than I intend here. There are a couple of important things that have to happen to get the ecosystem to work. As you hear, I'm kind of focused on this ecosystem. One is there's been no marketplace for demonstrating effectiveness or proving what works. It had no benefit. If you had a product that worked and you had a product that didn't work, if you had equal sales forces, you had equal opportunity to win. That is how our marketplace has worked heretofore. What we were trying to do through I3, whether you agree with the theory of action or not, is to make that pipeline of innovation clear. That says we need lots of new ideas. We're going to give you resources and support to do that. And we're going to stimulate people that are not at scale to do things from the outside and come with it. But we're also going to take those ideas that have strong evidence and we're going to create a market opportunity for them to actually start to get access to more resources. Now, there is a certain disturbing irony in the fact that the highest evidence standards in the department are tied to a program called Investing in Innovation. What I would say, personally, is that there ought to be large funds attached to preferences for folks that have demonstrated they're really effective. But in the meantime, we've created that pipeline. In the short term, you're absolutely correct. Technology, with the way our schools work and with our kids work, is about how you actually empower them to do their best work through the use of technology. That's what happens best, and how do you reinvent the process of what they're doing because they have access to the technology. So there's no disagreement there. I think people are still very unclear about how to do that and what that looks like and how to make sure that they are hitting that perfect spot in the Venn diagram where they've not gone too far away so that they lose their staff and their students and parents, importantly, and where they just replicate what they've been doing all the time digitally. I think people are struggling with that, and I think that is going to be the struggle going forward. Sir, you were here first in the back.
Thank you, Jim. I'm Jeff Livingston from McGraw-Hill Education. First of all, thank you for your service. Listening to you is always an inoculation against the cynicism too many of us have about people who devote themselves to public service. I appreciate that. I intend to add to the long list of phrases I have stolen from you over the years. The question always is, for whom and in what context, that you said a few minutes ago. I wonder if you would spend a couple of moments giving some advice to both the internet startups and some of the established players about what we should be doing for the kinds of students who haven't been talked about at this conference as much as I think they should. Poor kids, kids in rural areas, kids who don't speak English at home, kids who don't know anyone who went to college, kids who don't live in Palo Alto, California.
Sure. So first, thanks for the kind statement. The reality is that we have a really unprecedented opportunity through the introduction of education technology to pursue two outcomes that we have kind of held as separate and apart: excellence and equity. For a long time, whether we will admit it or not, we have treated those things as if they are in distinct tension. And in fact, they're not. When you think about the rural communities that we just talked about, technology affords them the opportunity, just like it does schools that are under-resourced in inner city communities now. There is no reason that every school in the country shouldn't have access to every AP course that exists, every foreign language that can be taught. There is no reason for every child not to have that opportunity. That is an opportunity that has not existed until this point. And it is actually, I am anxious for folks that are well established to figure out how to actually rush to that market and serve them well, just doing that. But the other thing that's true is that we have not been able to serve our kids who are most under-resourced well, period. And we start to know, and we've seen, some of which we learned from the last round of what we thought were the most innovative things, with people really creating high-performing schools. They need more time. They need more support. They need more resources. Technology affords a great opportunity, if it's actually well designed, to identify those gaps and help fill those gaps for those students. In particular, particularly powerful when it can be connected to the information coming from the school and then feed it back. Another opportunity to address the concerns. However, the cautionary thing I want to say, and I always feel like I'm ending on like a cautionary note, but if we aren't very intentional about this, this opportunity will serve to exacerbate the opportunity gap. Kids who have access to resources and technology will be able to pursue their passions and interests and go at lightning speed. And kids who don't will be left in the old system with limited resources and limited access, and they will never be competitive. And it is playing out every day to day, unless we actually do something, I will say as a nation, not necessarily nationally, but as a nation, that's the way it's going to be.
Hey, Jonathan here from Resilient Network Systems. I wanted to get your thoughts on the 4 Ps that I just came up with and the conflicts between them. So it's performance, personalization, privacy, and proprietary interests. So I think we all agree objective is to improve performance at every level. Improving performance requires deep personalization for the student's experience, the parents, the teachers, districts, every level. But personalization means you need to connect a whole bunch of data from a bunch of different places, analyze it, understand it, feed it back to somebody, and then close the loop. Obviously, that creates issues with privacy, and then proprietary interests. So you have vendors who think that's their data, or districts who think that's their data, or students or parents, and they're all either concerned about how it will be used in ways they don't approve of. Either they don't want to be measured, or they don't believe they'll be measured fairly, or somehow won't align with their interests. So if you want to get sort of market mechanisms at national scale, what are your thoughts on those conflicts and how we might go about resolving them?
So the only people who are, this is my opinion. So my opinion is that the only people who are right about who owns that data in that sentence were the parents and the students. Everyone else gets to use it, if those parents and students give them permission. Parents and students de facto give permission to the schools and school districts in which they go into. Then the question becomes, who else gets to borrow that data, and for how long and for what purpose? And then what else can they do with it besides just use it to serve the needs of that particular student? I think that the flip answer to the proprietary interests and how this will serve the private markets is an unfortunate one, but it's the true. I think that the reality is that almost every other part of the sector has shown that we are pretty much willing to sign away our rights to our private data for the convenience of better service almost every single day. There are small segments that don't, but people do it every day. I think we need to actually think harder about how we construct environments that protect people from making decisions that they don't realize the second and third order implications of. Because it's not, the thing we also know about the marketplace is it's not usually transparent about those things. So I'm not clear yet what that looks like. What I am clear is that those mechanisms need to be put in place, that it's going to be a combination of technical solutions as well as rules and regulations, that the one thing that is true in every privacy law is that you are entitled to your own data. And so there ought to be almost a constitutional right that no system or technical system or school system or otherwise can keep you from your own data. And then the question is, how will people create solutions that take this data from these variety of sources and address the needs of personalization? In that context, the simple question is, what is necessary? Excuse me, I'm sorry. What is necessary? And can you do that in a way that doesn't allow people to get additional proprietary insight into the individual as opposed to the analysis that they need to perform their specific task? If we can make that distinction, it'll put more burden on the developers, but if we can make that distinction, I think we won't have many problems. Easier said than done. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Jan McSorley. I'm an assistive technology specialist for the Austin Independent School District here.
Yes, ma'am.
And one population that I don't hear a lot about at a conference like this are kids with disabilities.
Yeah.
And I'm very concerned about how the innovation movement is going to include them because statistically, approximately 80% of students who have disabilities don't have a cognitive disability, which means that if they're properly accommodated, they can
Yep.
perform at grade level or above. And yet, most of the schools who fail to meet AYP are failing to do so because of their kids with disabilities.
Yep.
So with assistive technology, we can overcome the barriers of a child's disability, but what we can't overcome are the barriers in the content that are man-made, because people that are developing content in the educational technology arena are, for whatever reason, very resistant to comply with the accessibility standards. So when our district has looked at software products and tried to find products that we can use with kids with learning disabilities who cannot read, we can't find products that are accessible that meet those standards. So I would like for you to speak to
Sure.
how the programs that you are managing are going to be able to address that, because
Yeah.
I think what we have is discrimination by oversight,
Yeah.
and we have to do something to stop it.
So two things. One is, I think you're exactly right. The interesting thing about all this, again, actually I'll save that so I can end on the positive note. The reality is that there are two things in tension right now. One is that you're trying to stimulate new innovations and get people to try new things. The second then is, how do you actually make sure that as those innovations become available, demonstrate that they can serve populations well, that they are available to all students. The accessibility regulations are actually very clear. And this is one where I push it back pretty quickly to states and school districts, which is the market will respond if it is a requirement of the RFP that you actually meet the minimum standards for accessibility. And it places a burden on the marketplace. And so I'd be very thoughtful about at what stage you actually do that, at what size purchase it actually makes sense to do that, because there are solutions that, I mean, when we talk about personalization, there's solutions that are not going to be well suited for every population. And so if it is narrowly tailored, then the question is, should they have to bear the full burden? But for those things that are meant to be broad solutions, then I see no reason why in a large multi-million-dollar purchase, for example, there shouldn't be an accessibility requirement. So that's the regulatory answer. The other side of this whole thing is, the unique thing about where we're trying to go in education now is almost all the work is about personalization. The heart of special education for years has been about individualized work tailored specifically to meet the needs of that student, to allow them to be successful and allow them to make progress. And so if we can actually marry those two things, then we can actually make significant progress for all populations. You look like you're about to disagree. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add what you were saying there about the individualization. I mean, the accessibility standards are very good standards for responsive design. So when we're looking at going mobile, I don't think that companies understand that the return on investment for paying attention to designing for our most at-risk kids, and that's one of the elements that you say, we need to look at how we can help the kids that are our worst performers. I mean, when we have 40% of the prison population having a learning disability, there's something wrong with the way we're educating those kids.
Right.
So we just have to make a business case to the developers when they seek money through the National Science Foundation or whatever, that they need to look at how they can make that accessible, because those standards are not impossible to meet. It's not a technology issue, it's an issue of will.
Understood. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Whitney Hunter-Thompson, and I'm a change consultant and find myself to be a budding entrepreneur. And I have an observation, a question, and then a quick explanation for the question. The observation is that innovation in education, where we're going, is getting away from the command control. And yet, at this conference, and even this talk, is still command control, right? So you're up there, you're talking, we're sitting here listening, having our own thoughts. But there is very little sort of interaction or experience, project-based learning, if you will, in this one lecture. So the disconnect in my head is why we're talking about getting away from this model, and yet we're talking about getting away from the model in the model. So my question is, what role does the administration...
My guess is your company is going to fix this problem.
I hope to.
Okay.
Any funders in the room? So my question is, what role does the government play? Can the government play a role in sort of changing the way we have the conversations. And the explanation for the question is, one, the way you articulate revolutions really resonates with me personally, so I think that I'm particularly interested in your opinion, but I also think that if nothing else, the administration has proven that they can go about things in a different way in the context of getting voters. So they've really created a totally different conversation with the voters, and so I'm wondering if there's any applicability to changing the conversation in education.
It's a great question, and I don't want to diminish it by giving you a flip answer that's inadequate, and I don't think I actually have an adequate one. Really interesting thing about that I've learned about the way, like one of my retirement plans is actually to write a book called The 101 Things We Do to Make Our Government Work Worse. And one of them is that we have regulatory barriers to open conversation with citizens. And let me give you an example. So those of you who follow I3 knows that we put up this platform called innovate.ed.gov. And it was meant to be a community where people could share their ideas and connect with each other and connect with us, and we could give feedback and help make those connections. We are prohibited from keeping any information about anyone that would allow us to be responsive in that kind of a context. So literally, we had to push the platform to other people to do that because we can't talk to you if we know who you are. It's a very odd phenomenon. So I think that there is a need for us to rethink how we actually engage the public, how we create platforms for open communication, how we actually do things like this so we can both learn and do at the same time. I don't actually know what that looks like, but I'd love to talk to you more about it. But that's not just as simple as what you can do in the private market in terms of creating a new kind of platform and a new way of thinking about engagement. It's also got to have a new regulatory framework to go along with it that gives us much more freedom. People who have paid close attention to what we're doing, you'll notice that there's this funny thing that happens where we put things up as drafts on the website for comment, and then you never quite see it come out. Since I've been there 4 years, I'll tell you, do you know how long it would take me to get out a document otherwise? So when I actually go to publish, sometime in the middle of the second term, it would actually come out. So those are the kinds of things that I'm working through, but I would love to get really good ideas about how to change the way the dialogue works. How are we on time? I think we're close. Okay. Is there a last question for the last 2 minutes? Yes, ma'am.
I hadn't heard any teachers speak yet, so I wanted to get out. I'm an ESL and science teacher here in Austin at the high school level, and I wanted to respond to the idea of separating teachers from the content, which Giselle brought up. English language learners are now 20% of the public education students in this country, and it's the fastest growing demographic. Most of them had some kind of services in elementary school. Middle school tends to be a wasteland for them. A lot of them experience chronic failure. And by the time they get to high school, most of them are disengaged from the learning process because of chronic failure. Their language acquisition needs require reading, writing, speaking, and listening in every lesson every day. And passing them off to technology is not a solution to the problem. It's a supplemental aid, but the supports that teachers of these students need are so much broader.
Thank you for saying that. So I'm glad you said it, because I had decided to let that pass, but let me be clear. One of the challenges that we have, frankly, as a sector, is that we so quickly devolve into thinking that we know what it looks like, what the solution actually needs to look like. And we don't. If we did, then we'd have figured it out and done it already. We don't know what it needs to look like. We don't know what it needs to look like for every single student. We don't know what the marriage of technology and teachers is going to look like. We don't know, I hear what you're saying, and I think that's absolutely right. There's new research out that shows that even for especially for the youngest children, the social agent, especially around language acquisition, the person who they're learning it from, is the primary determinant of whether or not they're going to do it. The research is control study after control study, very clear that without that, it doesn't happen. So I think we have a lot to learn about how we actually create the kinds of learning solutions that are going to work for every single kid every single time. It may, in some cases, look like what Giselle described. For your population, it may look different. Again, for whom, in what context is going to be a big part of all of this. But I don't want us to think that we have the answer for any population yet. We know what we know today. Tomorrow we'll know something different, and we'll evolve the solutions there. So with the work that we need to be doing is to create the context for lots of innovation, lots of productive innovation, things that are significantly better than the status quo, things that can go to scale, things that are going to serve parts of the population, things that can serve the whole population, things that can work for all kids, some that can work for only some kids. We have to create the context for all of that to happen, given that we have limited set of resources, and it means we need to be very strategic. It's very important that you got up as a teacher who does this work and said, here's how my world works today. Here is my experience about how I can meet my students' needs today, given the tools I have available. Perhaps someone in this room will come to you and say, I think I may have something for you that will solve part of your problem and give you more leverage so you can spend more time with those students who do need that kind of touch. And there are other students who are independent who can work with a little bit of technology to help. I hope that happens. Either way, the notion is we need to create the space for it to happen and then get out of the way. Thank you to everybody who's here.